Hello and welcome back to another Age of Sigmar painting tutorial. In this video I'll be showing you how you can paint your Kurnoth Hunters in a summer theme. And as always I'll be using the Citadel range of paints to do so. Now before I proceed I would just like to say a big thank you to Alchemist Workshops for donating the miniatures for this tutorial. So here we have the Kurnoth Hunter, or at least part of him, that I'll be using as part of this tutorial, and I've primed it using the Army Painter's Uniform Grey Spray Primer because I always find that grey it works as an excellent base colour for these mid-colour miniatures, such as got a lot of browns and light greens as well. Now you may notice that it's missing its arms and is also its head. I've split these off in two separate sections, as you can see here, as it makes painting a lot easier. You don't have to do this yourself, but it does make things a lot easier later on. And the first task in painting this miniature is to paint all of the inner wood sections. So we've got, you can see here just on the inner section of the leg there, also on the arms as well, and just on the neck as well there. We're painting all of these areas, first of all, with Rakarth Flesh. The reason we are starting here is because it's generally better to paint from the inside out, as it's a lot easier to paint these areas when you don't have to poke your brush in, trying to avoid areas that you've already painted. So as you can see here, I'm just making sure that I get a nice even coverage. Now I would always recommend mixing in just a small amount of water with these base colours, as it just gives you that much better coverage. It makes a lot easier painting. It's always better to do two thin coats as opposed to one thick coat straight out of the pot. And you can do this in a number of ways. First of all, you can just apply a small amount of water to your paint, or you could use a wet palette like I do. With the base coat completed, the next step is to wash over the Rakarth Flesh we painted in the previous step with Seraphim Sepia. The reason for this wash is it will pull into the recesses, as you can see it's doing here, create some really nice shading, and also give the Rakarth Flesh a slightly more woodish feel. As you can see here, it's almost as if it's fresh wood. It's just been, the bark has been pulled away from. Once the wash has dried, the next step is to highlight the strands on these lighter brown areas, and first of all be using Ushabti Bone. For this step I'll be using my thin brush here just to pick out these individual strands like so, just very carefully dragging my brush along them. Now I've mixed in just a small amount of water in with the Ushabti Bone. It just makes applying much easier. The next step in painting this miniature is to paint all of the bark areas, so this includes the chest, the legs there, the feet, and also the actual main section of the face as well, and also the shoulder pads and also the forearms. I'm painting all of these areas with a base coat of Dryad Bark. Again, for this base coat I've mixed in some water with my Dryad Bark, and even though it is a base layer, it still makes it much easier to cover over if you apply two thin layers as opposed to one thick coat straight out of the pot. You can see I'm making sure I get into all these recesses here as well, and just being careful not to overspill onto the areas that we've already painted. With the Dryad Bark completed, the next step is to really bring out the detail in the bark. We've got all these cracks and crevices, and we really want to emphasize those, and for this we'll be using a wash of Nuln Oil. Now how strongly you apply the Nuln Oil really is up to you. Personally, I'd prefer just to apply quite a watered down amount. We don't want to darken it up too much, we just want a nice subtle amount on there just to pick out all of these details on the bark. For the next step we really want to emphasize the bark effect across the Kurnoth Hunter, and for this we'll be applying a highlight of Gorthor Brown. For this step I've mixed in some Lemmy Medium in with Gorthor Brown, roughly 2 parts Gorthor Brown to 1 part Lemmy Medium, and this is so that it creates a much finer coverage. You can see here what I'm doing is I'm applying the brush in this perpendicular motion to the edge here, and this creates a nice bark effect. And you see the actual Lemmy Medium has thinned down the paint slightly, so it's not going on quite as thickly. It becomes a lot more subtle in its gradient between the lighter edges and also the darker areas due to the wash of the previous step. Now we're also going to be picking out some of these raised sections as well with the same mix, and again we'll just want to apply some perpendicular streaks to create some nice bark effects. With the first stage of highlights completed, the next step is to perform some second finer highlights. We'll be focusing this around some of the hard edges, such as around the chest here, and also some of the upper edges, such as this little knot here, and also some of the upper sections of the legs. And this time it will be a highlight of Baneblade Brown. This time I've only mixed in a small amount of water with the paint, as I don't really need it to be as transparent as the previous step, and I'm just going to be focusing this around this edge here. You can see I want to create some perpendicular lines, and this will really add texture to the surface. Now when I actually come to highlight some of the other sections, as I said, I want to pick out some of the upper sections. If you imagine the light coming from above here, it would be these upper edges which will be brighter, so I'm just going to be applying the brighter paint there. Following that step, the bark is now complete. Now the next step is to move on to all of these green branches and vines that we've got dotted across the entirety of the miniature, and we'll be tackling these with Deathworld Forest. When applying this step, you will need to be much more careful than you have been in previous steps not to overspill onto the painted areas. As you can see here, we've got these little vines. I'm just carefully picking them out, making sure not to paint over the bark that we painted in the previous steps. When the green base coat has been applied, the next step is to really bring out the definition in these green tendrils and vines there. And we're going to be with the base coat completed, the next step is to wash over all of the green areas with Athonian Camoshade. The reason I'm using Athonian Camoshade instead of Bealtan Green as a wash is because it's a little bit more olive in its colour, and it kind of maintains that earthy green colour that we've already got going on. As you can see here, I'm making sure I apply plenty of the wash because the actual bumps and troughs of the green areas are quite shallow. We really want to emphasise them, so I'm going to be applying quite a bit of the wash here just to really bring those out. With the Athonian Camoshade wash dried, the next step is to start highlighting these green areas, and for this we'll be using Elysian Green. When painting natural and organic things, it's generally good to have a much more subtle blending between highlights. So I've mixed in some Lamia Medium with this Elysian Green, roughly 1 part Lamia Medium to 1 part Elysian Green. The reason for this is because when I apply it, it'll apply these much smoother gradients, and it just generally looks a lot more realistic than really sharp transitions between the lighter and darker colours. So as you can see here, I'm just picking out the raised sections, leaving the darker green visible in the recesses. Now that the first highlight has been completed, the next step is to form a second, more extreme, finer detailed highlight on the green areas, and for this we'll be using Nurgling Green. For this step, I'll be concentrating on the upper raised areas, all those that are particularly prominent. Now I've mixed in some water here. You don't really need to mix any Lamia Medium, water will do fine, and if you're using a wet palette, you shouldn't even need to add any at all. As you can see here, I'm just very carefully just adding small dots of the Nurgling Green to these raised sections along the top there. Now the next step is to paint the blade. Now these steps are the same regardless of whether you're painting the sword, the scythe or the bow. And the first step is to base coat the entirety of the blade with Celestra Grey. As I'm going for the ghostly blade effect, this acts as a really nice base colour that we can wash over on the next step. As you can see, I've mixed in just a small amount of water here just to improve the coverage, and I'm making sure I get into all of the blade areas. Just make sure you don't overspill onto the bark areas that we've painted already. With the base coat achieved, the next step is to give the blade a ghostly feel, and for this we'll be using a wash of Nihilakh Oxide. By applying the Nihilakh Oxide over the blade, you can see straight away we get this nice ethereal look to the blade as it pulls into the recesses and gives us this nice ghostly greenish grey colour. I'm making sure I get across the entirety of the blade, and then especially around the bottom here where we have the recesses. As you can see, the Nihilakh Oxide has left the blade with this nice ghostly feel, and we're going to enhance that slightly by picking out some of the edges along there, and we'll be using White Scar for this. Applying White Scar straight out of the pot is a little bit too strong for our needs, so what I've done is I've mixed in 1 part Lamia Medium to 2 parts White Scar, and this creates this subdued white colour. You can see here I'm just using to pick out the edges, just very carefully picking out these details here just to enhance them. With the blade completed, the next step is to paint the teardrop just inside the chest there. We're basing this first of all with Sotek Green. When painting the teardrop, you want to be extremely careful that you don't overspill onto either the brown or the green areas. The reason why we left it to this point is so we can clearly see exactly which parts need to be painted, as it can be tricky to differentiate between the teardrop and also the green vines that hold it in place. With the base coat applied, the next step is to wash over the teardrop using Drakenhof Nightshade. Again, when applying this wash, be careful not to overspill onto the green vines. We just want to bring out the definition and the detail within the teardrop. As you can see, the Drakenhof Nightshade is pooling into those recesses. When the wash is dried, the next step is to emphasize the detailing on the teardrop, and for this we'll be using Temple Guard Blue. Using a detail brush and just a small amount of paint on the brush there, it's going to be very carefully highlighting these raised sections. As you can just see, just dragging the brush very gently across the surface and to just pick out the edges. And again, just be very careful not to overspill on either the bark or the green vines that hold it in place. The next task is to paint any of the fungus that's growing across the miniature. For example, some are here on the chest, and we'll be base coating this with XV88. Now I'm using XV88 as the orangey brown colour of it will really contrast nicely against the dark brown and green of the rest of the miniature, without contrasting so strongly that it just seems out of place. You can see here I'm just making sure I get it across the entire area, making sure not to overspill onto the areas we've already painted. With the base coat applied over the fungus, the next step is to wash over it to create some shading using Agrax Earthshade. All we need for this step is to just apply a quick wash over the surface of the fungus, making sure it pools mainly against the bark itself, and this creates some nice shading as you can see here. After allowing the wash to thoroughly dry, the next step is to highlight the fungus with Tout Light Ochre. So for this step, all we want to do is to just drag our brush along the edges of the fungus, just very carefully creating this nice thin highlight. With the fungus completed, the next step is to start painting some of the leaves that we've got on the end of the vines here, for example these ones, and we'll be base coating these with Caliban Green. So all we need to do is just apply the Caliban Green just to the leaf tip there, leaving the rest of the vine the light green that we painted in the previous steps. Now the Caliban Green is a base coat, should have no problem covering over this lighter green, but just make sure you don't overspill too much onto the vine. With the base coat applied, the next step is to highlight the leaves, but also paint in the insides of these recesses here. Now there's also, on the shoulder pads here, we've also got the face as well. So we've got this pattern on the face and also the eyes, and we'll be applying the same techniques to both. First of all, we'll be using Warpstone Glow to both highlight the leaves and also to paint the insides of the markings. Now this technique generally works better if the leaves... This technique generally works better if the Warpstone Glow is slightly watered down with a little bit of water. As you can see, I'm just making sure I just highlight the very edges of the leaves. Now when we actually come to paint the insides of this mark here, we don't need to worry too much if we overspill. It just creates a nice glowing effect. So I'm going to be mainly aiming to paint the insides. And as again, having the Warpstone Glow watered down does help in this situation. We just want to make sure we paint the insides of the markings. As you can see, the Warpstone Glow is also already creating this nice glowing effect in the wood. The next step is to enhance this by going over it with some Moot Green and also highlighting the leaves as well. When painting the leaves this time, we'll be focusing our attention mainly on the very tips. As you can see, I'm doing just here, just creating this nice little highlight. And then when we actually come to paint the glowing inscribement in the bark there, we're going to be applying the same kind of technique as we did before. However, we're going to want to be a little bit more precise in our application. We want to mainly focus just on the inside bits, leaving the darker Warpstone Glow visible in the outside bits. Now one of the final steps of painting this miniature is to just apply some extreme glow into these recesses here, and for this we'll be using Dorn Yellow. So I'm painting the glow, I'm just going to be applying it inside, as you can see I've already done here. We want to apply it to specific points, not across the entirety of the actual inscription. Just want to pick out very specific parts. And here we have the completely assembled and base Kurnoth Hunter. Now, as I've already mentioned, the same techniques could be applied to any of the Kurnoth Hunters, regardless of which weapons they are carrying. Additionally, you could use the same colour scheme I've used in this video to apply it to any of the Sylvaneth miniatures. If you enjoyed this tutorial, do let me know in the comments below, and also subscribe to be kept up to date with all of my future videos. Additionally, if you would like to support me in making more tutorials, you can do so by heading over to my Patreon page, which you can see a link to on the screen now. From there, you'll be able to donate to me from as little as $1 a month, and that'll just really help me in the future in making more of these tutorials. You can also be kept up to date with all the projects that I'm working on by heading over to my Instagram or Facebook pages, which you can find links to in the description below. And finally, a huge thank you to Alchemist Workshop for providing the miniatures that made this tutorial possible. You should definitely check out their web store, and I'll pop a link in the description below, which should take you directly to them, where you can find Warhammer Age of Sigmar and also 40k sets for up to 24% off the RRP, so definitely check those guys out. And until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.